The Women by Kristin Hannah. Enlisting against the odds. Enlisting against the odds. The morning was filled with unease. Frankie had never seen her parents this disappointed, their expressions a mix of shock and dismay. She could still feel the sting of her mom's words. "You're meant to find a husband, dear, not to run off to war." "But Mom, it's not about finding a husband," Frankie pleaded. "I want to be there for him. Finley needs me." Her mother, Deborah, shook her head. "Frankie, your brother enlisted by his own accord. He's fulfilling his duty as a McGrath, just like your father did." Frankie sighed, frustration creeping into her voice. "But I'm a McGrath too, Mom." Across the table, Frankie's father, Jim, finally cleared his throat. "Francesca, your mother and I only want what's best for you," he said, his voice a mix of concern and firmness. The conversation lingered in the air as Frankie retreated to her room, her mind racing with thoughts of Finley, her brother, somewhere in the jungles of Vietnam. She remembered the soldier she'd met at the hospital, his stories of the nurse who'd stayed by his side, a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. It was then, in the solitude of her room, that Frankie made her decision. She would be that beacon of hope too. With a heavy heart but a determined spirit, Frankie stood resolute in the living room later that day, the recruitment papers clutched in her hand. Her parents' faces were a mix of shock and disapproval. "You can't be serious, Francesca." Her mother's voice trembled, a hand fluttering to her chest. "I am, Mom. I've made up my mind," Frankie replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "But nursing in Vietnam, it's no place for a young lady," her father interjected, his brow furrowed. "It's exactly where I'm needed," Frankie countered, her resolve unwavering. "This is bigger than me, Mom. Finley's out there, and there are so many like him who need help." "What about college? Your dreams of becoming a biologist?" Her mother sighed, sitting down heavily on the floral couch. Frankie's passion for biology had always been a quiet rebellion against the expectations set upon her. She had found solace in the methodical study of life, a contrast to the life her parents envisioned for her. But now, faced with the harsh realities of war and the stories of soldiers like the one she'd met, her path had shifted. The desire to make a difference, to be part of something greater than herself, had taken root. Her father shook his head, pacing the room. "I just don't understand. We raised you to be a good wife, to start a family." "I can still do those things, Dad. Just not right now. Right now, I need to do this," Frankie insisted, her mind flashing to Finley's letters, filled with reassurances and laughter. "I know you're worried, but I've never been more certain about anything. I want to make a difference just like he is." Jim McGrath stopped his pacing and looked at his daughter, his eyes softening. "You have your mother's spirit, Frankie, and I suppose a bit of my stubbornness too." Deborah reached out, taking Frankie's hand. "Promise us you'll be careful, Francesca." "I promise," Frankie said, squeezing her mother's hand. "I'll write every week just like Finley." With a heavy heart but a determined spirit, Frankie left the comfort of her home, stepping into a future fraught with danger but filled with purpose. As she walked towards the recruitment office, the soldier's words echoed in her mind. "It's the nurses who keep us going." She was ready to be one of those nurses, no matter the odds. Into the fray. The relentless whir of helicopter blades cut through the humid air as she stepped onto the tarmac of the 36th Evacuation Hospital. Her heart raced, a mixture of adrenaline and fear pumping through her veins. She had trained for this moment, yet nothing could have prepared her for the chaos that greeted her. "McGrath, over here!" shouted a voice. Turning, she saw a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense bun motioning her over. This was Ethel, one of the seasoned nurses she'd been told about. Beside her stood Barb, whose warm smile seemed out of place in the pandemonium. "Welcome to the fray," Ethel said, handing her a clipboard. "You're on triage duty. Remember, quick assessments. We need to know who needs surgery now and who can wait." Nodding, her throat tight, she watched as medics rushed past, carrying soldiers whose moans and cries filled the air. She swallowed hard, steeling herself for what was to come. A young soldier was brought before her, his eyes wide with shock. "Please," he whispered, "don't let me die." Her hands trembled as she checked his vitals. "You're not going to die," she said, more to reassure herself than him. "We're going to take care of you." As the hours passed, she found her rhythm, moving from patient to patient, her confidence slowly building. The chaos of the emergency room became a blur as she focused on each wounded soldier, their faces itched with pain and fear. "Stay with me," she would say, holding their hands, offering a comforting presence in the midst of the madness. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the hospital tents. Nestled amidst a grove of palm trees, the 36th Evacuation Hospital stood as a beacon of hope, its canvas tents fluttering in the breeze. Her shift was ending, but in the relentless tide of war there was no end to the wounded. Just as she was about to collect her belongings, a new wave of urgency swept through the hospital. A medic team burst through the entrance, carrying a soldier on a stretcher, his uniform a stark contrast of crimson against the khaki. "We need you." Barb's voice cut through the fading light. Dropping her bag, she rushed to the soldier's side, her fatigue replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Together with the team, she worked to stabilize the soldier, her hands no longer trembling but sure and efficient. As they lifted him onto a bed, she caught his gaze, a silent bond forming in that brief exchange. "I've got you," she affirmed, her voice a steady beacon in the tumult. The night deepened, and as she finally stepped back, her body ached with exhaustion, yet her resolve was stronger than ever. She had not only faced the day's trials, but had emerged with a deeper understanding of her role in this war-torn world. As she lay down, the distant sounds of conflict a constant reminder, Frankie realized that this was just the beginning of her journey at the 36th Evacuation Hospital. Finding her calling. Frankie McGrath's day began before dawn at the 36th Evacuation Hospital. The previous day's surgeries lingered in her thoughts as she prepared for another round of operations. Captain Jamie Smith, her mentor, assigned her to assist him, recognizing her growing skill in surgical nursing. Despite her initial nervousness, Frankie's competence shone through as she adeptly supported Jamie during complex procedures. Her confidence soared with each life saved, affirming her purpose in the midst of war. A pivotal moment came with Private Jorge Ruiz, whose critical condition tested Frankie's resolve. Advocating for his treatment, she and Jamie worked in unison to save him, solidifying her commitment to her vocation. Over time, Frankie's expertise and compassion earned her the respect of colleagues and patients alike. Beyond the surgeries, it was the personal stories of those she treated that deeply impacted her, reinforcing her sense of duty. In the chaos of war, Frankie discovered her passion for nursing, a calling that would influence her long after the conflict's end. Bonds of war. The sun was setting over the Vietnamese landscape, casting a warm glow on the mobile hospital tents. Inside, Frankie McGrath assisted in surgery, her hands moving with precision. Outside the operating room, Ethel waited for her. The older nurse had become like a sister to Frankie, sharing not only the burdens of war but also the rare moments of peace. "Frankie, come on, let's take a break," Ethel urged, her hand on Frankie's shoulder. They walked together to their favorite spot by the beach, where the sound of the waves offered a brief respite from the relentless sounds of war. They sat on the sand, watching the horizon. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Ethel," Frankie confessed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Ethel squeezed her hand. "We'll get through it, one day at a time." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Barb, another nurse who had become part of their tight-knit group. "Hey, you two, look what I found," Barb exclaimed, holding up a battered radio. With a flick and a twist, Music filled the air, a song from home that made them all smile. For a moment, they were no longer in Vietnam, but back in a world where war was just a word, not a reality. As night deepened, they talked about everything and nothing, from childhood memories to dreams of the future. Frankie shared her fears and hopes. Tragedy struck when Jamie was caught in an unexpected attack. His death left Frankie reeling, her heart broken. She found herself at the beach again, the place where they had shared so many talks. Ethel found her there, sitting alone. "He wouldn't want you to give up," Ethel said softly. "We have to keep going." Frankie nodded, wiping away her tears. "I know, it's just so hard." They sat together in silence, watching the sunrise, a new day dawning. It was a reminder that life goes on, even in the midst of war. As Frankie returned to the hospital, she carried with her the memories of Jamie and the strength of her friendships. They were her family now, and together they would face whatever the war threw at them. Loss and longing. The neuro ward was silent, except for the beeping of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses' feet. Frankie sat by Jamie's bed, her hand gripping his, as if she could will her own life into him. His breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle against the infection ravaging his body. "Jamie, please," Frankie whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to hang on." Jamie's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, there was clarity in them. "McGrath," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Tears welled up in Frankie's eyes as she watched him struggle. But it was too late. Jamie's hand went limp in hers, and the steady beep of the heart monitor turned into a long, unending tone. The nurses rushed in, but Frankie knew a Dory. Jamie was gone. In the days that followed, Frankie moved through her duties like a ghost. She and Barb clung to each other, finding solace in their shared grief. They talked about the war, about anything that would fill the silence. One night, as they sat on the edge of their bunks, Barb spoke softly. "It's hard, isn't it, losing someone you care about?" Frankie nodded, her throat tight. "It is, but we have to keep going for them." Barb took her hand. "That's the spirit, Frankie. We honor them by living, by carrying on." As the days turned into weeks, Frankie found herself seeking solace in the small moments that reminded her of Jamie. The way the sun set over the horizon, the laughter of her fellow nurses, the strength they all found in unity, it all brought him back to her in fleeting, precious memories. She carried these fragments of the past with her, letting them guide her as she poured her heart into caring for the wounded, into every act of kindness, every moment of compassion. It was her way of honoring Jamie's memory, of keeping their unspoken promises alive. In the quiet and the chaos, Frankie continued to heal, to hope, and to love. Coming home. Frankie stepped off the bus, her army duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and looked around. The familiar streets of her hometown seemed to have shrunk, the houses more colorful, yet somehow less vibrant than her memories. She took a deep breath, the scent of freshly mown grass mingling with a tinge of apprehension. Her parents' house stood at the end of the street, unchanged. As she walked up the path, the front door swung open, and her mother appeared, a forced smile on her face. "Frankie, my dear," she said, her voice quivering. "You're home." The embrace was stiff, the air between them filled with unspoken words and unshed tears. Her father lingered in the background, his eyes avoiding hers, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. At dinner, the conversation was stilted, revolving around trivial neighborhood gossip. Frankie's experiences, her service, the war. These topics were carefully skirted, as if by ignoring them, they could erase the past months. Later, Frankie lay in her old bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house was oppressive, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the field hospital. She missed the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, even the adrenaline-fueled chaos. The next day, Frankie visited the country club where she once worked as a lifeguard. She felt the weight of stares as she walked across the pool deck. Whispers followed her, and she recognized the judgment in the eyes of those who knew she had served in Vietnam. The country club was a world away from the war-torn fields of Vietnam. Frankie felt like an outsider, a stranger in her own community. The members, once friendly acquaintances, now eyed her with suspicion or pity. She could almost hear their unspoken questions. What happened over there? Did she kill anyone? Is she damaged goods now? As she passed a group of women, she overheard snippets of their conversation. Such a tragedy. What happened in Vietnam, one whispered, and her poor parents having to endure all that. Frankie's heart twisted. She knew they were talking about her, their words laced with condemnation and pity. She wanted to shout, to defend herself and her choices, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she kept her head high and walked on, feeling the weight of their judgment with every step. It wasn't just the community that struggled to accept her service. Her parents, too, had deeply hurt her. They had lied about her time in Vietnam, telling people she had been working as a nurse in a safe hospital, far from the front lines. Their shame and fear had driven them to conceal the truth, leaving Frankie feeling betrayed and alienated from her own family. One morning, Frankie found herself at the town's memorial park, standing before Jamie's grave. The marble stone was cold and smooth under her fingers, the engraved name a stark reminder of the cost of war. She placed a single red rose on the grave, her silent tribute to a fallen friend whose memory had haunted her since the war. In that quiet moment, Frankie felt a sense of peace, a connection to Jamie that transcended the barriers of life and death. As the days passed, Frankie's resolve strengthened. She became more involved with the League of Families, her efforts evolving from writing letters to organizing local awareness events. Each step forward was a step toward healing, not just for herself, but for the community that had yet to understand the sacrifices made by those like her. In the quiet hours of the night, Frankie reflected on her journey. She had come home a different person, molded by the trials of war and the pain of loss. Yet she realized that her core, the desire to make a difference, remained unaltered. This realization brought a newfound determination to continue advocating for the missing and to honor the legacy of those who had given everything. Frankie McGrath, once a soldier, was now a warrior for peace and remembrance. Finding purpose. The night was still as Frankie walked through the quiet halls of the San Diego hospital. She paused at the nurse's station, where Mrs. Henderson had left a list of tasks for her to complete. As she made her rounds, Frankie's thoughts drifted to the friends she'd left behind. She entered a room where an elderly woman lay sleeping, her breathing labored. Frankie gently took her hand, the same way she had held countless hands in Vietnam, offering comfort without words. "Mrs. Garcia," Frankie whispered, and the woman's eyes fluttered open. "Is it time for my medicine?" Mrs. Garcia asked, her voice weak but hopeful. "Not yet," Frankie replied, squeezing her hand. "I just wanted to check on you." Mrs. Garcia smiled, and Frankie felt a warmth spread through her. This was why she had become a nurse, to make a difference one patient at a time. In the weeks that followed, Frankie sat by Mrs. Garcia's bedside, holding her hand through the night. Frankie realized that this was where she was meant to be. In the quiet moments, in the gentle touch, in the shared glances of understanding, this was where she could heal, not just the patients, but herself. And when the sun rose, casting a new light on the hospital room, Frankie knew she had finally found her way. She was no longer just a nurse trying to prove herself. She was a guardian of hope, a beacon of kindness in a world that often seemed too dark. One evening, as Frankie sat with Mrs. Garcia watching the sunset through the hospital window, she felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you," Mrs. Garcia whispered, her eyes closed. "For what?" Frankie asked, smiling. "For being here," Mrs. Garcia replied. "For caring." Frankie's heart swelled as she squeezed Mrs. Garcia's hand. This was why she had become a nurse, to make a difference, one patient at a time. Healing and reconciliation. Frankie sat on the porch of the beach bungalow, her hair dancing gently in the sea breeze. The old wishing well in the front yard stood as a silent sentinel to countless unspoken dreams. She gazed at the letter in her hands, its edges worn from her constant handling. It was an invitation to the memorial unveiling the following week. "Frankie, you've been out here a while," Ethel said, joining her. "You need to take care of that letter." Frankie looked up, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I know. I can't stop thinking about the memorial. It's like all we've been through is leading up to this moment." Barb appeared with a tray of tea, setting it down to embrace Frankie. "It's more than a moment, Frankie. It's our history, our pain, and our chance to heal." The three women sat in comfortable silence, each reflecting on their own experiences of the war, the friends they had lost and the invisible scars they bore. Later, Frankie's mother arrived with a casserole, her voice gentle and filled with concern. "Frankie, dear, you don't have to isolate yourself. We're here for you." Frankie's voice was steady, but her eyes shone with unshed tears. "I know, Mom, but I need to do this for Jamie, for myself." As the day of the memorial drew closer, Frankie's emotions intensified. The bungalow, once a sanctuary of solitude, now buzzed with the laughter and support of her dearest friends. Ethel and Barb became her anchors, steadying her when doubt crept in. The night before the unveiling, sleep eluded Frankie. She found herself in the nursery, bathed in moonlight. The half-finished mural on the wall seemed to glow softly. The next morning, the beach was alive with people, some known, some strangers united by shared loss. Frankie stood with Ethel and Barb, their hands clasped tightly as the cloth fell away, revealing the names of those who had served, including her brothers. A hush descended and Frankie stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "We remember not just the fallen, but the living who carry the weight of war. Today, we begin to heal together." As the crowd dispersed, a gentle squeeze on her shoulder startled Frankie. She turned to find Rai, his eyes reflecting a mix of sorrow and hope. Frankie's heart swelled with a mix of love and grief. "And I never stopped loving you," she whispered. Rai simply nodded, the unspoken words hanging between them. Together, they turned to watch the waves, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of the sea. A reminder that life, like the ocean, continues to ebb and flow, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. Frankie knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but with the support of her friends and the memory of her brother fueling her resolve, she felt ready to face whatever came next.